So I'm Shelley Garnham. I'm the Tuberculosis Advocacy Officer at Results Canada. This is a project that we've been partnering with ICAD, the Interagency Coalition on AIDS and Development. We've been partnering with them for quite a long time, but on this specifically for the last year or so. We've been working on a bunch of activities, information, webinars, different pieces in lead up to the high-level meeting, during the high-level meeting, and after the high-level meeting. And so this is sort of one of the next steps after the high-level meeting to give everybody a bit of a debrief on what happened and what comes up next. So we have some incredible speakers. I'll be touching a little bit on the Canadian perspective, but we'll kick things off with Mandy Slutsker, who works at Action, based in the US, but it's a global partnership. And then we'll have Nandita Venkateshan, who is from India. She is a TB survivor and now passionate, amazing advocate, and who actually spoke on the floor at the UN General Assembly addressing the high-level meeting. And then we'll have some questions at the end. Just one flag that's really important for everyone to know. Our speaker, Nandita, is hard of hearing. She's actually gone entirely deaf from the medication that she took to treat her tuberculosis. So it makes the logistics a little bit more challenging. So I really encourage everyone to use the chat function as much as they can. We have Kate Alexander, who works for ICAD. She's doing a bunch of the background work and stuff. So she'll try to monitor the chat. You can raise your hand at the bottom if no one's paying attention, or if you're on video, you might be able to raise your hand and flag me down and let me know. But I try to encourage you to use the chat so that she can participate and know as much of what's going on as possible. And with that, I think I'll take my happy Halloween ears off. We'll get to business. So Mandy, I'd love to throw it to you.
Great. Hi, everyone. I am going to share with you my slides. Okay. So, hi, my name is Mandy Slutsker. I'm based in Washington, D.C. at the Action Secretariat, and Action is a global health advocacy partnership. So we're made up of 13 organizations across 5 continents. Results Canada is one of those organizations. I was the co-chair of the TB high-level meeting Civil Society and Affected Communities Advisory Panel. And so happy to share what we did as the advisory panel and to go into sort of the purpose of what the advisory panel was, what we achieved overall at the high-level meeting as a TB community, and next steps for civil society or anyone that's not part of government. In terms of achieving the high-level meeting targets. So first is the purpose of the advisory panel. So the role of the advisory panel was to have 15 representatives and voices from across the sort of civil society and affected community spectrum to influence the high-level meeting. And our major objectives were to engage in meaningful participation of civil society and affected communities throughout the process. And we did that by facilitating a listserv, the TB Civil Society listserv, which still is in use. And so everyone could know what was going on. And also to have a civil society hearing in June, where we got as many people to be involved as possible, as many voices to be heard at that hearing, and help to organize meetings with UN missions. And then our other big objective was to get a political declaration that was meaningful, ambitious, funded, and includes the concerns of civil society and communities. I will go into that. What we accomplished is, so we helped influence the key asks document. And if you haven't seen that, it's just a couple pages of the sort of key asks that the TB community wanted to get from the high-level meeting, what we wanted to see in that final political declaration. And I'll go through and show what we asked for and what we got. But in the asks, we were able to get ambitious targets, including language on human rights, things that maybe other people might not think of because they're very focused on epidemiology and it's not their thing, but it's up to civil society and affected communities to really push for human rights and person-centered care. We also work to influence members of parliament who are involved in the Global TB Caucus and helped them engage in outreach to UN missions. We were part of organizing the civil society hearing, which was on June 4th, and included voices of people affected by TB, and helped arrange 28 UN mission meetings just on June 6th alone, alongside the civil society hearing, and then tried to get high-level attendance at the high-level meeting in September. We didn't necessarily have the attendance that we really wanted. I think we only had maybe 14 heads of state, but we were able to get a lot of ministers of health and other high-level people who maybe wouldn't have even considered going because of the consistent push that we put on people. And so we tried to make sure that everyone in their own country had the tools and the resources they needed to engage their governments. Okay, so what did we achieve? Okay. I go through each key ask and explain what we wanted and then what we got. So the first thing was to have a goal of reaching all people by closing the gaps in diagnosis, treatment, and prevention. And so I would say out of all the things in the whole document, there were two that we felt were the most critical, or that I felt, I'll speak on behalf of myself. Having a treatment target and having a financial target were the two things that I thought mattered more than anything else. And if we got nothing else in this declaration, I thought it would still be worth it just to have those two things. So we wanted to make sure that countries committed to diagnosing and treating a cumulative 40 million people between the years 2018 and 2022. So that included being treated in the public sector, being treated in the private sector. We also wanted specific targets for drug-resistant treatment and treatment of children. And we got those targets. So that was a huge achievement. One difference is the text said that it would provide treatment with the aim of successfully treating. So not necessarily ensuring that everyone would be successfully treated, but that's a pretty minor thing in relation to the overall goal that we got. And we even had a target for children with TB and children with drug-resistant TB. So that was great. And then we wanted targets on prevention, and we got them. They just weren't the same exact targets, but I think they were good nonetheless. We wanted 80 million people. Apparently we ended up getting 30 million with specific targets for children and targets for people with HIV/AIDS. Now, right now, there's only 1 million people around the world that access TB preventive therapy, and we're trying to get that to 30 million. So whether it was 30 million or 80 million, it's still a drastic change, a drastic scale up. And so I still think that was a success. So key ask 2 was really focused on human rights. I think we did a very, very, very good job with this. We got people to talk about, the declaration talk about policies on the right of people to know their TB status, talk about accessible, affordable, and equitable care. We wanted a commitment to remove discriminatory laws and end stigma and discrimination by 2020. We got the language, but not a year. So that will be a bit difficult in terms of accountability, as you know, when we have something that governments agree to, but there isn't a deadline. So, but at least it's in there. We also got language on TRIPS. This was a huge issue for where I live, the United States. They do not like talking about intellectual property, anything that could be seen as infringing on intellectual property rights. And so there was a big disagreement between the US and South Africa that led to a major delay in the process. And there was even a period where we thought we might not get a political declaration, but we got it got resolved. It just took a little bit of time and finessing of language, but at the end, TRIPS, which is the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, flexibilities, which allow for flexibility on IP for the need for health, ended up being in there. And then we wanted references to the key populations in the global plan to end TB. They mentioned many of those populations, but not some of the ones that you and I know can be controversial for some governments, including sex workers, undocumented immigrants, indigenous people, homeless, elderly, people with disabilities, and LGBTQ. For Ask 3, we wanted an accelerated development of new tools. So we got a lot of mention of it, but not with specific dates, because I think countries and many people knew that we're not necessarily on the path to getting the treatment, the diagnostics, and the vaccines that we want by the dates that were listed. So they mentioned vaccines, they mentioned drugs, and they mentioned diagnostics, but they didn't put dates. But there was an acknowledgement that TB innovation is a shared responsibility, and that R&D efforts need to be needs-driven, evidence-based, and guided by principles of affordability, efficiency, and equity. Now, this is the second thing that I thought was the most important, which was having a financial target with a date. And we got that. It was $13 billion per year by 2022. Right now, the whole world together gives about $6.9 billion to TB programs. It's not including research, not including development, just TB programs. That's money that the Canadian government gives to the Canadian TB response, that the Canadian government gives to the global TB response, and every other country as well. This is going to be a huge thing moving forward. Then we also wanted a specific target and date for R&D investment. We didn't get the breakdowns that we wanted. We really wanted countries to give a certain percentage of their gross domestic expenditure on research and development. So looking at their GDP, and based on the GDP, how much they should give to R&D for TB. But there was a commitment to mobilize $2 billion a year. The problem is that there wasn't a date set for when that should happen by. And then the final ask was on accountability. And here's where things didn't really get to where we wanted, but there are still many opportunities moving forward, which I will share with you. We wanted to have a commitment to another UN high-level meeting. That was not completely discounted, but we didn't get it in the declaration. That's because the UN is moving away from sort of like vertical program meeting, just vertical stuff. They want to talk about universal health coverage, not just TB or HIV or malaria. We wanted an annual report on how countries are doing towards these targets that was reviewed by an independent body and published by the UN Secretary General, and we did not get that, but that doesn't mean that there's not an opportunity to have reports. You know, we wanted TB to be listed sort of as a regular agenda on current, upcoming heads of state meetings. That wasn't listed specifically in the text, but it, again, doesn't mean it can't happen. But the big win that we got was a commitment to multi-sectoral actions. And I can explain what some of the next steps are on that. So then the big thing is what's next for us. And so here is where this is what we need to do next. We need to engage members of parliament and country officials, so with whatever relevant ministries you work with, to make sure they're aware of the global targets, the 40 million people on treatment, the 13 billion for TB funding, but also what their share is. So the country level breakdown. Now, the Stop TB Partnership did modeling to show what each country is responsible for under that overall 40 million target. So for Canada, it's not very high. It's to treat 8,800 people by the end of 2022 with TB, and including 97 drug-resistant TB cases and a little under 500 children. that's not very difficult, but definitely something that it would be important for Canada to achieve. Now, the big thing is making sure every other country is aware of what they need to do. India, for example, where Nandita is from, is like home to over 1/4 of the 40 million target. So if India fails, the whole global target cannot be met. So it's really important to focus on countries with these high burdens and figure out how to make sure that they can achieve the targets. Some people are worried that these country level breakdowns are either too ambitious, meaning we're setting countries up to fail, or they're not ambitious enough. And my response to that is the 40 million was what the world needs. It was agreed to by every country in the world, every government that's part of the UN. And the target breakdown, the breakdowns of it was done based on epidemiological data. So if people don't like the numbers, it's not necessarily, they're not political numbers, they're just numbers based on how many people are getting sick in each country. So how many people do we need to find because of who's getting sick? Now, we don't want to set countries up for failure, but they need to be aware of how many people are getting sick in their country to know just how big the problem is. And this is a way to do that. And so I think these numbers are a really useful political tool to let countries know, hey, this is what you need to do to achieve the goals that you signed on to. What I think is really important is this financial target, the 13 billion. What we don't have is a breakdown of that by country. And you can imagine why. Because the donors already think they're giving a lot of money and probably don't want to give that much more additional money. And the high burden countries are like, well, we're poor, we don't have enough funding to do all of this. And so it's a constant tug of war over whose responsibility it is to fund this. Now, I think it's important to talk about both countries' own responsibility, domestic resource mobilization, making sure they put money into TB programs, maybe at the expense of military or other budgets. It's very, very important that they put their own money into the health system, and that we make sure that that money is also going to procuring drugs, things like that. At the same time, donors have a big opportunity coming up with Global Fund replenishment in 1 year. You guys know Canada hosted the last Global Fund replenishment. It was hugely successful. We need to do that same thing all over again. And we don't even have a hope of getting some of these targets. So it's really, really important that Canada steps up to the plate again. I know that there's a lot of discussion on what is Canada's, what is the goal for Canada? It might just be to maintain the current pledge that they're at, but just very important for Canada to step up. And also TB Reach is something that Canada invests in and is also hugely useful. And then the next sort of big thing is there is a mouthful, but like tuberculosis multi-sectoral accountability framework. And this is the World Health Organization's, I view it as sort of like a box with different components, and it's empty. And each component needs to be filled by different accountability tools. A report on, treatment, a report on financing, all these different things. And we need to make sure that this framework is filled in with all the pieces that we want the WHO to collect, or we want countries to share information about. And so there's a lot of work being done on this, and there is a listserv for people who are interested in engaging just on accountability. So happy to circulate that after this call, how to get involved in that. But I think in terms of next steps, the big thing is to make sure that your government is aware of what happened at the high-level meeting, what was agreed to, and makes sure that we have the tools necessary to hold other governments accountable for what they agreed on. And this is something Canada has been a champion on. They've been talking about the importance of accountability, on having data, on having the tools to be able to engage other countries. And I'm happy to take any kind of burning questions, but there'll be time at the end as well. And I will stop sharing my screen.
Thanks, Mandy. That was a fantastic overview, and I think set the stage really well. As Mandy said, I think if anyone has any burning questions that you just need to ask right now, feel free. I encourage you to put them in the chat box. But if not, I'll give it a couple of seconds here. It looks like everybody's okay. There's a lot of information there, and we'll make sure that we make stuff available for people, including things like the listserv on the accountability framework that Mandy talked about. So thank you, Mandy. And I think from here, we're going to go to Nandita. You'll catch me every once in a while. I'm going to type in the box to communicate with Nandita because she obviously can't hear what I'm saying. So I'm going to let her know that we'd like to hear from her. She's going to give a bit of an overview of what her experience has been like, not only as a TB patient, but being involved in the HighLevel meeting process. So let me just let her know. Oh, Nandita had a question, actually. Nandita was wondering if Mandy can elaborate on what the vertical programming by the UN they are discontinuing.
So they're not discontinuing. There's just been a push to not have disease-specific meetings. That it would be better to talk about health overall than to talk about specific diseases. And that's sort of just where the UN is going. That's where I think the world is going, and that's why universal health coverage has gained such attention, because it encompasses all of the problems related to health and all of the solutions. So that's just a trend. It doesn't mean we'll never have another meeting on tuberculosis. It just means these specific types of disease meetings, I think, are going to become less frequent.
Thank you. Sorry, I was just typing that answer for Nandita there. That was very helpful. And let's see if she can get going. Let's see. Sorry for the bit of dead air there. I think she's going to get going right away.
Am I audible? Okay. So, firstly, I must thank you all for having me here, because I have been involved in TB awareness work for like 2 years now. I think 1.5 to 2 years, and I have seen that of late I'm seeing my and survivor voices being included, which is a great thing, and it is a very positive development, I believe. It is important that our voices are included even more going forward. Let me tell you briefly about what was my battle with TB. I survived intestinal tuberculosis twice, and I fought an 8-year-long battle against this illness. It started from 2007 and it ended just in 2015. So it is not so long ago, and it's not a very distant memory. It is something that's very fresh, and the wounds that I had to survive are very fresh, and it is going to take some time to heal them. I had, in the process of getting treated, I had to undergo a series of surgeries in my stomach. I was also bedridden for close to 2 years, completely bedridden, and in the process of taking up a so-called life-saving drug named kanamycin, I ended up losing my hearing. An injection named kanamycin took away my hearing indefinitely and permanently, which was a big blow for me, because I was just all of 24 when all this happened to me. My hearing was happened very suddenly, just 2 days after I had celebrated my 24th birthday. So it was a big shock, and it was something that was extremely sudden and drastic. Um, for so I realized that this is a disease that is that is especially a problem in my country, because as Mandy said, India is home to is home to the highest number of TB patients. So definitely, when I started looking beyond the problem from just beyond what was happening to me alone, I realized that this is something that many others, not just in India, everywhere else are going through. In fact, I have been involved in helping TB patients regularly, and I'm actually helping a multi drug resistant TB survivor from the US, and I'm helping MDR TB patient from the US, which was actually revealing to me, and I realized that this is a disease that does not know boundaries. The kind of pain he's undergoing in the US, I could relate to it sitting here in India itself. He's also having to pop those dangerous pills. He's also undergoing treatment for depression and psychosis that I had to undergo, and he's also feeling that his dreams and his ambitions have come to a grinding halt, just as I felt. And he is the same age as me, which for me, to be frank, meant that this disease does not discriminate, it does not see borders. It can happen to me in a developing country sitting here. I'm helping someone across the border in the US sitting here. So I realized, taking this into account, I was privileged to get an opportunity to speak at the high level meeting that concluded last month in September. I spoke about what had happened to me, and I highlighted three main aspects that I think need urgent attention in TB. I derived the three aspects, considering the time was less. I derived the three focal points from the key asks that the civil society panel had formulated along with my own interactions with patients. So I highlighted 3 points. One is faster diagnosis and quicker test to check for drug resistance, which is known as drug susceptibility testing. Many patients today are not they don't undergo this test upfront, which means that they are forced to take pills endlessly, sometimes even end up taking wrong pills that do more harm than good. So once you are diagnosed correctly, you know which medicines will work for you and which won't. So that was my very first point. Second point, I spoke about the countries needing to scale up and follow the WHO recommendations. The recently announced recommendations on reducing the usage of injections and increasing the usage of bedaquiline and delamanid, which is where a problem came up, including the fact that the US was restricting the usage of trips for for making available affordable drugs to developing countries. But this is something that is acutely needed, because I ended up losing my hearing 4 years back, and I know even today, just last week, I got to know someone else has also lost her hearing, which is extremely saddening, and which is happening because we are not willing to make available the benefits of science to everyone. This for me is extremely unacceptable, that when you have newer drugs in hand, why can't the benefits reach everyone? Maybe I would have had my hearing had I got bedaquiline some time back. That did not happen. That is why today I'm struggling to understand what everyone is speaking. And third point I made was to involve survivors like me. For me, the fact that the UN had me is an important step, but I want that this continues going forward. Every meeting, every conference, every scientific medical conference should have a survivor voice, should have a community voice. A survivor voice or a community voice is an absolute must. You cannot be restricted to just having doctors and medical practitioners and practically living in an echo chamber when you don't know what is happening, what are the benefits of your research. Reaching people like me is what you need to know, and this reality check can be given only by someone like me. So I pushed for this at the UNHLM, and I'm glad to say that I was very happy to get the big standing ovation I got. I was extremely humbled to the fact that that people applauded my speech, but I also realized that this is frankly just the beginning. We have a long way to go after this. I wanted that my speech galvanizes everyone sitting over there, every heads of state who has come, every minister of health who has come. It has to galvanize them into taking action now. You cannot be waiting and telling me I'll do this later, sometime later. No, you need the framework in place now, because things are really slipping out of hand. And I'm not exaggerating here, because I'm telling this from my own experiences with speaking to several patients. I realized that this is a disease that hits you when you're absolutely young, when you are in your 20s. And for me, this disease also indicates the gulf between the developing and the developed countries. Do our lives not matter than what the lives of Mandy or Shelley matter? Is my life, does my life come cheaper than than probably the life of Mandy or Shelley? I don't think so. My dreams and my aspirations are exactly the same as what Mandy or Shelley will have or anyone else will have. But for me, this disease represents the gulf that exists between the developing and the developed world. And the only way to bridge this gulf is that developed countries need to step up leadership in eliminating TB. They need to commit funds. They need to make the developing countries accountable as well, and they need to commit more funds for research. Yes, the developing countries will stand up. I'm seeing India slowly committing to things, and it is important that the developed countries continue their funds into research and development of newer drugs, newer vaccine, and vaccine is absolutely needed. I speak here today to a Canadian audience. I know probably for all of you, TB would mean that you may not be aware of it. But I know that it is important that all of you must get up, must stand up to this cause right now. And because if it affects me, it is also going to affect. I know Canadians are also affected by it, and it is important that Canadians, the Canadian Health Minister, the Canadian Prime Minister shows leadership in this and increase and commit funds to TB even more. I sincerely hope this happens going forward.
Thank you, Nandita. That was fabulous. And just so everybody else knows, we have my colleague Kate, who is typing some of this information to me, so I know that Nandita is getting the message. That was fantastic. I've heard you speak so many times, and every time you move me a little bit. I think that was a real passionate call to action. And I think for me, one of those big pieces that you touched on, and that I think is relevant to us as a Canadian audience, because I think people on the call and joining are coming from all perspectives. Some work in domestic TB, working with Indigenous populations. Some are working with immigrant and newcomer populations. Some are working from a global perspective. So we have this really wide ranging thing, but to me, the one constant is the patient. And that patient perspective, though different, everyone is different, it's also so similar. Like they can connect, Nandita can connect with someone in the United States, which has a vastly different system of operating and health system and all of those pieces are so different, but they share the same challenges. They're both struggling with the drugs they have to take, with the depression that they face, with the challenges that a patient feels. And I think that's really what is at the heart of not only what motivates us, but what drives us all together is this community that is looking to end TB. So we come from government and civil society and NGOs and passionate citizens. But what drives us is this patient. We don't want patients to go through this anymore. So I really appreciate what you said. And I don't think your life should come cheaper than anyone else's. And I think that's true for anyone in Canada too. We face these same disparities that need to be addressed. So I think that's a lot of what this has triggered, is these discussions and people coming together and moving forward. You know, we're outraged, so let's move forward and see what we can do about this. So thank you so much for that presentation. I'm going to keep talking, and I'll give a little bit of the, I guess, the Canadian perspective. So I was lucky enough to join the Canadian delegation that went to the high-level meeting in the UN. I have a slide here to show you. Some of you may be interested in who else was joining that delegation. So let me quickly share, see if I get the technology right. Ta-da! Okay, so this is a list of attendees to the delegation, just so you kind of have a know-how of who is there. There was quite a good, considerable focus on Inuit people. Canada has a really atrociously high rates of TB in Inuit populations. And so they've also had a lot of work that's been going on across sectors and from the federal level down to the community level to really address that. So you'll see a bunch of Inuit and Indigenous representation there, as well as some doctors represented there, some people that are working on the ground. So just to flag, if anyone is interested in, I think if you know anyone that is on that list, you're interested in reaching out, I just wanted to provide it for you so you kind of have an idea of who is represented at the meeting. And what I'll flag next, stop sharing, you can see my face again. And so it was a really interesting experience. It was very overwhelming. The UN high-level meeting was during UNGA, the United Nations General Assembly, so it's just a flurry of mayhem and activity. And it's a lot to take in. I think it was a real huge accomplishment, and I was really privileged and honored to be a part of that delegation and connect with some of those people that I don't normally connect with. And that was something that was really inspiring for me in what I want to do moving forward and some of the next steps that we're taking, particularly within this Canadian community. As I said, with such disparate pieces of what we work on, but how can we take what was said at this declaration and the commitments that were made and move them forward? So Mandy was really helpful in illustrating some of the Canadian targets that, that will be useful for us in our work in Canada. You know, the treatment and diagnosis targets and drug resistant and for children. And, you know, look at the global burden, yes, Canada has considerably lower global burden, but I know that if you speak to any patient, it doesn't matter what the global burden is. If it's 494 children, then we need to test and treat 494 children. One is too many. So I think that really helps put that in that perspective. And then also speaking from the global role that Canada plays as a donor, as a leader on the global stage, hosting the Global Fund in 2016, the replenishment, and having the 2019 replenishment coming up. I think we're all gonna look to Canada to continue some of this leadership. And again, working with some of the representatives from the Canadian government throughout this process, it's been really positive. They have been really pushing things on the accountability framework. That's something that Canada has been leading on, which is really nice to see from the civil society perspective. They've also been pushing gender and human rights and Indigenous rights. So I just wanted to flag that Indigenous peoples are in the declaration as a key group. That's something that Canada has led on, in particular with women and children are in there. So those are some of the key areas that Canada has been leading on that I think we're really proud of and hope to see some of that work continue. Just in general, some of, I guess, my reflections from Results Canada of participating in the delegation and seeing Canada's interventions and speeches, we were really impressed with how, not just how well it was done, but how well it was received. I think Canada took an interesting and unique approach. A lot of these speeches were made by health ministers and some by prime ministers and presidents, which was great. But they lacked a little bit of passion and real know-how and knowledge in the disease. And I don't think that was the case for Canada. Minister Philpott represented Canada from the Indigenous Services Ministry, and she's so well versed in it and really truly cares. And in addition to that, she also ceded some of her time and interventions on the floor to Aluki Kotsirk, who is a political representative in the Inuit community. And so she was able to really ensure that those that are affected by this disease are represented in this venue. And that's a considerable, I think, achievement and statement. So I also just wanted to share, because I'm sure that not everybody had seen this, but we have just a clip of Minister Philpott's intervention during one of the multi-sector panels, and Aluki Kotsirk's intervention as well. So let's just share this here. It's only a couple of minutes long. Let's see if I can get it right. Okay.
About the work that we are doing, particularly to eliminate tuberculosis in Inuit Nunangat. But in order to do so, I have chosen to give my time to Dr. Aluki Kotsirk, who is the president of Nunavut Tungavik Incorporated. She is president of the largest Inuit region of Canada, one of the regions most severely affected by tuberculosis, and she will describe our elimination strategy now.
Tuberculosis, a preventable disease, continues to persist in Nunavut.
Okay,
Today, the prevalence of tuberculosis in Nunavut is 300 times higher than amongst Canadians and remains a major public health concern. This last year, Nunavut saw the highest recorded number of cases of tuberculosis since Nunavut was created in 1999, including 2 deaths. Currently, 17 out of 25 communities have tuberculosis present. The high rate of tuberculosis in Nunavut is rooted in multiple factors, including inadequate housing, food insecurity, poverty, and the enduring impacts of colonialism. Government-led tuberculosis control measures during the 1940s and 50s removed Inuit from their homes and placed them in tuberculosis sanatoriums in southern Canada. Many never returned home. Today, over half the population of Nunavut lives in overcrowded conditions as Inuit continue to face a housing shortage. Adequate shelter in Nunavut is a scarce resource rather than a basic right. People often have to sleep in shifts or on the floor. Access to nutritious food is a challenge. 70% of Nunavut's children live in food insecure homes, unsure of when and where to expect their next meal. Together, these factors contribute to a life expectancy for Inuit that is 12 years lower than the average Canadian. Fortunately, Inuit are resilient. We come from a strong people, a resourceful people. The Government of Canada has the political will, as demonstrated through the leadership of Minister Philpott, to commit to eliminating tuberculosis among Inuit Nunangat by 2030 and reduce active tuberculosis cases by at least 50% by 2025. This will be achieved through an elimination framework and action plan. While these government investments give us hope, we cannot lose sight of the desperate need for better housing conditions, for improved access to nutritious food, enhanced mental health wellness, and reduce barriers to health services in Inuktitut. The social determinants of health and the inequities that exist within Canadian society must continue to drive our work in order to fully and completely eradicate this entirely preventable disease.
So, okay, I'm back. So I'm glad you all had an opportunity to see that. I think it's a really important piece that obviously not everyone has access to. And I think it speaks a lot to what Canada has been doing at home and will continue to do, and is an example of what strong political leadership can do. Having someone like Minister Philpott, and partnering with Lupi Kociurek and President Nathan Obed, those kind of partnerships and real genuine passion to tackle this issue. That's what we need. That's what we need in India. That's what we need from the United States. That's what we need across the world. And so I think that's really great. And that's one of the really positive pieces that we can take forward from this high-level meeting and from Canada's representation. I think the next steps are really in what Mandy was talking about. How do we break this down further? What's the accountability mechanism? What's not just what's the global accountability mechanism, but what are some of the ways that within Canada, we can take some of that accountability and those promises that were made? How do they translate to newcomer populations? Newcomer populations in Canada are 70% of the burden. So that's a pretty serious population that we need to figure out how to do better. And so I think this is a real trigger for some of those next steps. I'm really excited for the way that this has opened up a dialogue. I think one of my most exciting things that I left that high-level meeting with was inspiration that this global community, Canadians, Americans, Indians, people from all over the world that are so passionate and that really are together. We are all aligned and we are ready to figure out how to do this more so than ever. And so I don't want to lose that. So I think that's really important how timely this is. And we have some events coming up in the next week that some people will be participating in a policy dialogue to dig deeper on what we can do in Canada and what Canada can do globally to make sure that this is not a lost opportunity to continue these conversations. So I encourage everyone that is watching and maybe watches this in the future to make sure that you are connecting with other people that are on this. So if you wanted to reach out, if you're curious to know anything further about the delegation, about the people that were on the delegation, if you wanted to know more from what Mandy has to offer, which is a wealth of knowledge on what is happening from the global perspective and the advocacy perspective. If you had questions for Nandita and what role she can play as a patient and advocate, I really, really strongly encourage you to reach out to us. I think what we'll do is in the chat box, perhaps we'll put our email addresses in and you can just reach out directly to us. Sorry, I'm throwing Nandita and Mandy in there. I hope you're okay with people reaching out directly. I'm pretty sure you are. But I strongly encourage you to keep this dialogue going and connect with one another, because I think that's where we're really going to get momentum coming. So with that, I wanted to see if anyone had any questions. We have about 10 minutes left. And I guess I open the floor for any questions for myself, for Nandita, for Mandy. Additionally, there are other people on, if you're online, you can see some of the other people that are on participating in the call. If you have a question for someone else that's participating in the call, I encourage you to also open that up on here. So I will pause now and see if there's anyone that's interested in asking anything. And also to say it's okay if we don't have any questions, we have further opportunities in the coming weeks.
And no question is like too small or 2 minutes. Like this is a really complex sort of UN policy stuff that I know most people don't engage on a day-to-day basis. So like there are no dumb questions, because I guarantee you I've asked all of them. There's a lot I still am learning throughout the UN process.
I have a bit of a question. So Canada has been leading on, I'm aware that Canada has been leading on some of the accountability framework and some of the other human rights pieces. Do you know any of the other allies globally that we are working with or should be working with?
So my understanding is that the US cares a lot about accountability as well. And David Bryden probably knows the people best who are engaging from the US side, and as well as Joanne Carter. I also think Australia has expressed interest in this. The kind of complicated situation is that it's may sound to implementing like high burden countries as if it's like donors from like the West trying to hold countries with high rates of TB accountable, and not necessarily like who's holding these donors accountable. But from the donors' perspective, is they're thinking we give all this money to the Global Fund, and in the US case gets a lot of bilateral money on TB, and they want to make sure that countries are investing their own resources as well. And I think the reason why it's mainly donors is there is a bit of better, I won't say better understanding, but the WHO, they don't trust the WHO to do it. And the reasoning is because the WHO is governed by the health minister of each country. And so if we're trying to hold the health minister and the head of state accountable for treating people with TB, and they're in charge of the WHO, they can't hold themselves accountable. It has to be an independent body. But the WHO has sort of convinced the high burden countries that they can do this and that they're best suited to do the job. And a lot of donors are like, but you're not. So the WHO collects data, but how the data is shared and used for accountability purposes, many people, especially Canada and the US, think that the WHO can't collect the data and then produce a report holding like a political report.
Right, that's really helpful actually. And I think that touches a little bit on, Linda had a question. Given our government seems on side, what can we do apart from lobbying them to move this forward? Are there any other targets? I think you touched a little bit on that, but I'm wondering if you can dive deeper a little bit.
So I think they could be pushing the Stop TB partnership to get a breakdown of financial targets. We need that 13 billion broken down. And it's going to be really political to get that. And I think that's really important.
What do you think is a realistic timeline for that? Because like I'd like it tomorrow.
I'm probably not the best person to ask. I would also like it tomorrow. I would say a few months, because I think the modeling may not take very long, but the negotiating, what seems reasonable, is going to take a lot longer, because it's not based on epidemiological data. It's going to be based on GDP and also how everyone thinks the breakdown should be between like the wealthier countries and the countries with the highest rates of TB.
Yeah. Okay.
And everyone wants everyone else to pay.
Yeah, which is a fun political game to play. There's another question here from Heather. She's asking about TB numbers in Inuit populations are obviously quite startling, and is wondering what the disease burden looks like in the rest of Canada, and particularly with people living with HIV. So I can tackle a bit of that, but I'm hoping actually I think there's some people from the Canadian public health sector that actually are a little better versed in that than I am. So if I kick it off and then maybe see if anyone else wants to touch on it as well. I think the number in my head right now is about 1,600 cases per year. Yeah, Linda Lord actually just put in some answers there. So she's, actually Linda, if you wanted to throw the link in, she's referring to one of the reports that says the cases and TB data annually, but it would be really helpful if you could throw the link in there. If not, I can go get it later, but yeah, I think it's about 1,600 cases per year. It is primarily in newcomer populations, so that's about 70% of the burden. And then it also falls quite a bit heavier on Indigenous peoples, with Inuit peoples very specifically affected. Inuit peoples are from Canada are about 300 times more likely to suffer from TB than, say, myself, which is incredible. And that has a lot to do with sort of the a lot of issues, but in particular the focused social determinants of health, but where Inuit peoples are living in Canada too plays a huge role in that, and why it's such a strong higher risk there. I don't know if Linda, you wanted to speak up and add any pieces that I'm missing, because that's like a real broad strokes look at what TB is like in Canada. Can I put you on the spot, or I don't know if you can, I don't know if we can hear you.
Oh, can you hear me now?
I can, you're there.
No, you can hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. Well, if financial accountability is a really important target, who can do this? Like, who do you target to bring this forward? Who's got the control?
So that's from Linda Lange. I'm gonna mispronounce your name. Linda Lange?
Lang.
Lang, sorry.
Doesn't matter.
No, that's a really great question on the WHO. I mean, it's any government, right? And it's the people who hold the purse strings. So it's a lot of it is your Minister of Finance. It's also who holds not just the purse strings, but the power. So sometimes it's your Minister of Health, or sometimes that's partly why we push so hard to ensure that presidents and prime ministers and heads of state and heads of government were attending the high-level meeting, because that's how high this has to go. Health budgets around the world are not putting enough money into the health budget, and then of that, they're not putting enough money into TB. Like we're halfway there, and so I think it's really got to go to that high ministerial level, and it starts on the ground, and that groundswell I think has to go up and knock on those doors now.
Oh, thank you.
I don't know if that's helpful for you. And
thank you. Yes.
Linda Lord from PHAC, the Public Health Agency of Canada, she affirmed for me, I am correct. 70% of cases of active TB are in foreign-born populations, and she'll provide a link for us. Someone had also, I wanted to touch a little bit on, they'd asked about persons living with HIV. I don't know those rates really at all. I know that they are harder to come by. It's not a serious issue in Canada as far as I understand it, though, for example, there are certain populations that are both key populations for HIV and are also key populations for TB. It doesn't seem to be that there is a huge rate of co-infection in Canada between those two. So even though it just falls in the same populations very commonly, they often don't seem to come together, which is very unusual because globally TB and HIV are the world's worst best friend. They're just, we call them the deadly duo. So unfortunately, I don't have a lot of information about that, but I think this next week, what will be really interesting in this policy dialogue, we're bringing together HIV community members and TB community members in Canada to bring those discussions forward. So I think hopefully we'll uncover a little bit more of that and learn some lessons from one another and how do we move forward, and perhaps uncover some issues that are heretofore unknown. Maybe they are higher rates than we know and we're not getting to it. So hopefully that will help open some of the doors in that. Just looking through some of the other questions. Any association between TB and immigration? Yes, and
I can take this if you want.
Go ahead, Mandy.
So yes, so the issue is that TB is often latent. And I don't know what your screening requirements are for Canada, but for the US, I think people are screened for active TB. So they are, they get the skin test here. If it's positive, they get a chest x-ray. If they have TB in the lungs, they're not allowed in the country. They have to go through treatment and all this stuff. I don't know if they're just not getting the preventive therapy or if they're getting it and it's not, whatever the case is. But a lot of people are coming usually in the US legally. So have their paperwork, everything, because they grew up in a country that had a high burden, they have latent TB. And then at some point later in life, at wherever, they develop the active disease when their immune system is down. And it doesn't mean that they acquired it in Canada. It just means it was already in their body to begin with. And it's just because, the people who are likely to get sick from TB often have latent TB that develops into active TB. And the people who are likely to have latent TB come from countries with higher rates. In the US, it's primarily actually immigrants from Asia, not even Mexico or whatever the latest concern is from some political people in my country. But it's not that immigration is dangerous, it's that people need better access to care in their own countries for prevention. So that when people move from one country to the next, which happens not just from immigration, but from tourism, from all kinds of reasons, it's very important that people aren't walking around with latent TB that could later become active TB. but it's also, we need to be very careful how we talk about TB in our own countries if we're the US and Canada, due to the type of language that's being used around immigration, and not making it seem like there are these immigrants who are coming and they're bringing these diseases, because that's not the case.
Thanks, Mandy. I think that's really helpful. And I'm just looking back on who had asked that. I think it was Solomon. I hope that was sufficient for you. And that's also something I think we're going to dig deeper on, because that's something that every country shares. Every country has, like Nandita said, the borders don't define where TB is. So, I mean, next week we're going to be joined by a woman from South Africa who is a TB survivor, and we're going to be joined with a woman from Clyde River. And if you look, Clyde River is closer to Greenland than anything, and South Africa is not too far away from the penguins in Antarctica. So, I mean, that's how far this disease stretches, and those borders are open to people too. And so I think that'll be a big issue we speak to. I wanted to get to, I think we're running low on time, and I want to be respectful of people. So I think if it's okay, we'll go last question to Megan.
Mine's actually more of a comment, so if there's going to be another question after, feel free to. But I just want to go back to Linda's question earlier about, you know, since Canada's on side, what we can do apart from lobbying. I think it's really important to remember that lobbying your government doesn't just mean asking them for money, especially when we're dealing with a government like Canada that has some influence and we know will be giving the money. Canada has seats on the boards of the Global Fund and Stop TB Partnership. And there are a lot of these decisions that, you know, we sort of the policy decisions that we want to see come out of them that need to be decided at the board. So things like, we want the Global Fund to increase the percentage of money that they give to TB as opposed to the other two diseases. That is a board decision. So Canada can be using its seat on the board to be pushing that position. The other thing we need to be pushing them on is to have a more ambitious global ask overall. They're asking based on political realities and not based on what they actually need. So those are just two things that I think are really important, that, you know, when we have a government like ours that is more on side and, you know, pledges early to the Global Fund and gives a bunch of money, we need to be lobbying them to be more active on within the board situations, to be pushing the policies that we need to see.
That is fantastic. Thank you, Megan. That's a really good point. And that's something that if anyone is interested, I'll give a shout out for Results Canada, the organization I work for, is some work that we do. So if you're interested in finding out more details, ICAD also does work on that. So the executive director of ICAD, who we're partnering with, the Interagency Coalition on AIDS and Development, they sit on the board as an alternate from the developed countries community. I can't remember what the whole title is, but anyway, Robin Montgomery is represented on that board as well. So both of our organizations work on that, and look forward to hearing anyone that has ideas or interest in doing more on that, because it's an important, Megan's the best. The Developed Country NGO Delegation is what it's called. Thank you, Megan. So mindful of the time, it's 5 after. I don't see any other questions in the chat. I hope everybody had questions that they wanted addressed. And if you'd like more information, I'm going to right now, can I ask Mandy and Nandita put their emails in the everyone chat function, and I will add mine. There we go. And I think Nandita will add hers. And so feel free to reach out with any additional questions you have, or if you know someone that you think is interested in this and should be engaging more that isn't here, or however, especially in particular for the Canadian context, please reach out to me and let me know, and make sure to connect one another and keep this dialogue going and answer these important questions. And then most importantly, in my mind, take action. And I think Nandita said it best in her conversation just earlier, that like, now is the time. I've had enough. She's had enough. We don't need any more patients and survivors. We just need to get this disease gone. So I appreciate everybody's time. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to Mandy, and thank you to Nandita. Thank you to Kate at ICAD for helping facilitate this. And I hope to keep the conversation going and talk soon. Happy Halloween.
Thanks, Shelley.
Bye.